realized you were going to have an interesting and exciting speaker today. I don't know where they are, but they don't show up. I'll do the best I can. I am Al Churchill. I'm president of the Croix Historical Society, which is centered in Calais. And I have to make a confession to you. I've always been jealous of Eastport because Eastport has so much history. I mean, there's so much history, so much interesting history that we don't have in Calais. And if you look throughout Washington County, I mean, Machias had the Margaretta, which was a one-off, and that's about it. And Calais, Calais has some interesting stuff, but Eastport is remarkable for a small town to have the history that it has. And the fact is, I don't know how many of you folks use newspapers.com. I'm sure that some of you are aware of it, where you can search not all the newspapers, but thousands of newspapers throughout the United States. And if you search for Eastport, beginning in 1800, it pops up hundreds of thousands, millions of times. It's just in the news all over the United States all the time for various things. Sometimes not quite so good, sometimes interesting, and sometimes a little wacky. But Eastport has always been in the news throughout the United States. And in fact, from about 1840 until the late 70s, the 1970s, if you ask somebody who was not here on the East Coast, someone from the South or the Southwest or the Northwest, to name a city or a town in the state of Maine, they would almost certainly not name Augusta, Bangor, or Portland. They would probably say Eastport. They would have heard of Eastport because they'd seen that name in the paper on any number of occasions. So Eastport is kind of for the size of the town or the city, whatever you call yourself these days, is always punched above its weight. It's always been in the news, and not always for the most edifying type of activity. And so there are three types of things that have made Eastport famous. Smuggling, okay, smuggling is number one. The War of 1812, of course. The fact that it claims to be the easternmost point in the United States, which is in contention as I understand it. And weather. And we're going to talk about weather with the Saxby Gale here in a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to go through the other reasons that Eastport is famous. Now, what we have here is an old painting, and I think this must be maybe, it may not be an accurate painting. Oops, no.
Sorry. Let's turn that part off.
This is a painting. Eastport is up here. Friar's Head is over here, as I understand this painting, or supposed to be. And this is probably about 1800. And you can give the next slide. Mr. Kilby, the famous historian of Eastport, who grew up at about this time, about in the early 1800s, and most of you have probably read his book or at least know of his book. He said that in 1812, Eastport was one of the most noted places in the country, and indeed it was, because its fame was the kind which no people would desire. The general impression was that its inhabitants were bold and reckless men and earned their support by sheltering and sharing the gains of adventurers, smugglers, and gamblers. So Eastport was in the news from the very beginning of the creation of the United States. And the reason that is true is after the Revolution, the British Empire and the new nation of the United States did not get along for obvious reasons. And there were embargoes and tariffs and restrictions on trade. You couldn't buy English goods and ship them legally into the United States. And the one place on the face of the earth where you could look across from the United States to the British colonies was right here on Passamaquoddy Bay. There was no other place that was closely approximate to England and the United States. And it had a bay that was not very far, not very deep, not very long. It was deep enough, but it wasn't very long. And it was very easy to not only could you look across the bay, but at night when there was fog, you could sneak across the bay without the British or anybody else knowing that you were smuggling goods in. And the American colonists, even though they were now Americans and not British, had a great desire to have British furniture, British china, spices from the Far East that the British were importing, the British being the most important economic importing power in the world. Americans wanted all those things, but they couldn't get them because the British wouldn't allow them into ports legally. And so Eastport became the smuggling center of the country in those early years. And this is such a kind of a drawing. This is Eastport over here. It's not a very accurate one. This is Friar's Head over here in Campobello. And how many of you know this home?
I had a question on your last paragraph. When did the British wise up to making legal sales?
When did the British what?
Wise up to making legal sales.
Oh, well, I'll get to that. I'll get to that. This home is the home of Benedict Arnold. It was on Friar's Head. You could see it from Eastport. Benedict Arnold, after he naturally decided the best place for him to live was not here because we'd have hanged him, went to London and lived for a while. And he made enough enemies in London that he decided, well, he didn't really want to stay in London. He came back and he ended up in Halifax for a brief time, then down to St. John for a brief time. And then he moved to Campobello and set up a trading post. And this was his house on Campobello in the late 1780s and early 1790s. And he was a trader. He was a traitor and a trader, okay? He wasn't a legal trader because there was no legal trade. He was a smuggler, just like everybody else on the bay at that particular point. So, you want the next slide? There was, as I say, the economy of this area was entirely centered on smuggling goods back and forth between Canada, the provinces, and the new United States. And in fact, this fellow here, Ebenezer Ball, was the first man hanged in the District of Maine. And he was hanged because there was very little money at the time. All money was species. It had to be actually gold and silver. The species itself was used for trade. Wasn't enough of it, and so people began to do what they call coining, which was to get a plug of non-precious metal, dip it in gold and silver, and then stamp it with a seal of often Spain or some other country, because it didn't matter as long as it was gold and silver, and use it in trade. And Ebenezer and his confederate were out in Robinson on a place called Moneymaker Lake, coining, as they said, and they were apprehended anyway. And they were coining in order to have the money to stimulate the trade here on the bay. And they hanged Ebenezer down in Castine, the first person hanged in Maine, as a result of his coining. His confederate jumped in a rowboat in Robinson and paddled across to St. Andrews and was never seen again. So he got away. He got away. All right, go ahead. Now to your question, it wasn't too long before the relationship between the United States and England began to get better, and a lot of the tariffs were removed, the trade restrictions were removed, and trade in the 20s and 30s and 40s came back to some extent, and the smuggling business became a little testy. There wasn't enough money in it. People had to be honest, and that wasn't easy. But then the state of Maine did something that was kind of remarkable for its time. It enacted the first prohibition law in the United States, which said essentially you can't drink, consume, possess alcohol. So obviously this was a great boon to the smugglers, because there was St. Andrews, there was St. John, right across the water. And so smuggling was back, and Eastport was back, and it greatly benefited this area. This is from a 1870s magazine showing them smuggling booze across the St. Croix River. Eastport and Calais, anyway, all along the river, became very famous as being a hive of smuggling at that time, and the national magazines played it up, and there were all kinds of articles about the desperados on the border here smuggling. Well, the next one. And here's a smuggler's den with all the bottles, and this is all French wine, and so this is from another magazine article about smuggling on the St. Croix River.
And all this was in the 18...
These magazines were about the 1860s or 70s. They're later on. But as soon as the law was passed in 1851, the smuggling began on an enormous scale here on the bay. So Eastport was famous for that. And of course, Eastport became famous by claiming it was the most easterly point in the United States. And here we have President Howard Taft visiting the most easterly point in the United States. That's later on, but you begin to find lots of articles in the paper about Eastport. And it's claimed that it was the most easterly point, and it was accepted. And Eastport became reasonably famous for that. If you had a racehorse in Kansas that you said you thought was the fastest in the country, you would say, my horse Dobbins is the fastest racehorse between San Diego and Eastport. And that would be in the paper. I mean, the papers were full of those kind of comparisons. And when President Taft decided to visit the four cardinal points of the United States, the Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, and Southwest, he picked Eastport, and he came here and visited Eastport. They drove him around one day for an hour or two. We had lunch somewhere. He's most noted as a president for his prodigious weight. He said it would have been the heaviest president in the United States, and that's about all he's known for, unfortunately. Although I will say that after he retired from the presidency, after the citizens retired him from the presidency, he became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was a very effective Chief Justice, and he was a very bad president, but that's neither here nor there. He was only here for a couple hours, and then he went to he had lunch, or a couple lunches apparently, and then he went off to Bar Harbor and spent the night and had dinner, and then he went back to Washington. But Eastport, as I say, became known as the most easterly point in the United States, and there were lots of articles in the newspapers. Go on to the next one. Yeah, this is an interesting one. This was in the papers quite often over the years about the Aleutian Islands, because in fact Eastport is not the most easterly point in the United States. There's an island off the tip of the Aleutian Islands, not very far from Japan. This is the most easterly point in the United States without any question at all. And so this every once in a while this would come up. There'd be this big discussion about whether Eastport was, the most easterly point. But this particular one just says that if you are in Seattle, where was it? Okay, they reach further west of Seattle than Eastport is of east of Seattle, and these kinds of things were in the paper on a regular basis. And for instance, here's an article from Mississippi, the Clarion of Mississippi, saying, from Eastport to the Golden Gate City, from the glacial summits of Alaska to the Rio Grande, it is all dear. All that God gave us and our families and all that. I want no pent-up Utica for me, but give me the widespread limits of the continent for my home, et cetera, the Isles, the Golden Isles, and all those sort of things. So Eastport was always considered the most easterly point, and when you wanted to make the point that this whole country, you know, a term that expressed the entire width of the country, you always used Eastport. San Francisco to Eastport, or San Diego to Eastport. So Eastport was in the paper for that reason on a fairly regular basis. But it always managed to keep itself in the newspaper. And then, go ahead to the next one. Oh yeah, this is a 1860s article in the Chicago Journal, just stating that that on the 17th of the month, there were about 50 miles of road to be built. The junction of the Union and Central Pacific tracks will be completed by the 1st of May, thus forming a continuous line of railway across the continent from Eastport to San Francisco, a distance of 3,500 miles. So as I say, Eastport was never much out of the news.
What year is this place? What year is this?
This is about 1860.
So was there a railroad bridge actually going to San Francisco with that bridge? Did you actually get?
You could take the railroad from, you could take, yeah, after they connected the Continental Divide, the railroad, all the way to San Francisco, you could take a train all the way.
There was a railroad bridge?
A bridge where?
To Moose Island?
Apparently, I don't know. That's what they say. No, maybe you're right. Maybe they had to walk across the water to get to Eastport. But I'm just saying that, I guess the point is that Eastport was always considered the most easterly point, and whenever you wanted to make a reference to, you know, a place on the East Coast, it was far, far away from wherever you were, it was always Eastport. It was always Eastport. I point to the next one. Okay, so the third thing that Eastport became known for was weather. And a term was used to describe the weather on the East Coast. And it became very, very used hundreds of thousands, billions of times. And that term is Eastport to Block Island. And after the Civil War, the telegraph was covered most of the United States. So a paper in Seattle or a paper in San Francisco or Natchez, Tennessee or Mississippi would get news and weather from the Weather Service. And so they were, and weather was very important in those days, obviously, as important as it is now, although more uncertain. And so the papers would, if you look at there, if you type in the term Eastport to Block Island in newspapers.com, which is only a small portion of the newspapers that are online, there are like 850,000 hits for Eastport to Block Island. I mean, that's how every paper, you know, in the country was using that term. And so people, as I say, when they were at, if people were asked, you know, what's a town in Maine, they'd say, oh, Eastport, because they just seen it in the paper for the weather. And this is the first reference I found in it. It has nothing to do with weather, but I found it kind of interesting. They talk about, he had long been funded, he was a lawyer, he died apparently, I don't know. But anyway, he had long been making fun of the bar and anecdotes in his college career, which he was undoubtedly, undoubted shrewdness was definitely outlined, were rife from Eastport to Block Island. And that term came to be used to cover the entire coast of New England. And then it eventually, we'll go to the next one. Oh, okay. And you can see this is an 1880s weather report, and again, and it says, the gale is sweeping the entire New England from Eastport to Block Island. So anytime there was a big blow on the East Coast, the weather would mention Eastport to Block Island as a,
Which they don't do anymore.
No, they stop. John, you should mention Block Island and Rhode Island.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, just go on to the next one, go ahead. And here's another one, this is 1896, West Indian hurricane sweeping New England coast from Eastport to Block Island. And on to the next one. Storm warnings, and this is later on, this is in the 20s. Again, Eastport to Block Island. All the forecasts on the Atlantic coast covered Eastport to Block Island. And so the name Eastport became synonymous with weather at that point. Oh, and here's one in the 1920s where they indicate that they've broken up a liquor smuggling ring that was operating from Eastport to Block Island. Good luck with that. Go ahead. And here we have the Eastport Weatherman. This is an article in 1957 in the Portland Telegram, which gives a little bio of a fellow from Eastport. I don't know how many of you know him, Walter A. Hicks. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah.
You know Walter?
You're welcome.
Yeah, he was the Weather Service's man at Eastport, and this article goes on. There's a long article about him, but it says, "Do you ever wonder where all the information about small craft warnings and 30-mile-per-hour winds comes from? Much of it originates in Eastport, with an automobile salesman and service manager named Walter Hicks, who, for the past 3 years, has been had the local distinction of being the end man on weather forecasts. Hicks has been a part-time weatherman and operator of what the U.S. Weather Service has listed a cooperative observer station since the regular service was discontinued. It says the service is in his backyard in a tiny back room of Hicks' neat little house. The back weather room also houses a teletype machine for direct communication with the weather stations in Portland and Boston. And at 7 a.m. before he goes off to work, he reads his gauges and codes and results and sends them to Portland, where they are coded and coordinated with other weather. So he, for many years, he was the one who told people in the world what the weather was going to be, and what the weather was in Eastport, and that was combined with the other reports to give the weather report for Eastport to Block Island, which was the weather on the East Coast. And these went all over the country, so people reading the weather reports would always see Eastport to Block Island. And I've always wondered about Block Island. Anyone been to Block Island?
Yeah, I have.
Oh, look, all kinds of people have been to Block Island. All right, I thought, well, it sounded to me like a rock. They had a weather station on it, but apparently it's not. It's right off Narragansett, Rhode Island, and you take a ferry, which doesn't take you very long if you want to go to Block Island.
They used to perform poetry in Block Island.
Oh yeah, okay. And it's quite a nice, it's a decent sized island. And go ahead, next one. And it's got all kinds of touristy things and an airport, and so yeah. So I just to let you know that Block Island, if you've got nothing else to do, or even if you do have something else to do, it might be fun to go there. And how long is the ferry?
About an hour.
An hour? Okay, well, anyway, so that's Eastport to Block Island, and as I say, it was one of the things that made put Eastport in the news for over a century, and that all of the weather forecasts included that phrase from Eastport to Block Island. Okay, so now we're on to why we're here. Mr. Saxby. This is Mr. Saxby, Stephen Martin Saxby, 1804 to 1883. he was a teacher. He had some engineering experience, apparently. He got himself a job teaching at the Royal Naval Academy in London. He had no experience in weather or that sort of thing, but he had some kind of engineering degree. And so he was a teacher, and he got to use the RN after his name, Royal Navy, simply because he was a teacher. He wasn't really in the Navy, but he was a teacher at the school. And in 1864, he wrote this book, Saxby's Weather System. And it was more, it wasn't particularly scientific, to say the least. It was more astrological and looking at signs of the relationship between the Earth and the Moon and the equator and the tilt of the Earth, and he had all these theories as to how we could predict the weather all over the globe by using these sorts of things. And he did from about 1863 start writing letters to the newspapers in London, the London Standard. I don't think he ever left London. It isn't like he traveled the world. He just stayed in London, but he had these theories about how we could predict weather all over the globe. And he was sort of disowned by the Navy. The Navy told him to knock it off because he kept making predictions that were really questionable, and people were believing them and reacting to them to their detriment. The English have a royal astronomer, if you believe that, they do. The royal astronomer told him to stop. And the British Meteorological Society tried to expose him as a fraud and told him to knock it off because, again, there were times that he made forecasts that people acted on to their detriment. But there were also times that he occasionally got it right. The old theory that even the blind squirrel sometimes finds the nut. That was Mr. Saxby. He refused to obey any of the authorities. He continued to make weather forecasts. And in a letter to the London Standard, December 25th, 1868, he predicted that, as you can see here, I now beg leave to state with regard to 1969 that on 7 a.m. on October 5th, the moon will be at the part of the orbit which is nearest to the Earth. Her attraction will therefore be of maximum force at noon the same day, and the moon will be on the Earth's equator, a stance which never occurs without marked atmospheric disturbances. And at 2 p.m. on the same day, lines drawn from the Earth's center will cut the sun and moon in the same arc of right ascension. The sun's attraction and moon's attraction will therefore be acting in the same direction. In other words, the new moon will be on the Earth's equator with a perigee, and nothing more threatening can I say occur without miracle. So he was predicting, this is about a year before the Saxby Gale, he was predicting this storm. But it wasn't really, he wasn't predicting it was going to strike Eastport or Brazil or England or any particular place. He just making predictions that everything is lined up for something really, really bad to happen. And he goes on to say that he in September of the next year, September of 1869, he will write again to warn people that this is going to happen, so in case they forget that he's given this warning. And indeed, on September 16th, 1869, he writes again to the London Standard. This is reprinted in papers all over the world. He said, "It is a high responsibility, but with my strong convictions resulting from experience, what am I to do when asked whether I will endeavor as much as in me lies to prevent loss of life and property? Can I forget the lives I may in person have assisted or saved? Can one ever forget his experiences when, on many occasions, forming one of a lifeboat's crew at the Goodwin? I don't know what that means, but he's essentially saying, and he goes on to say, this is going to happen, believe me. I warned you, and there's going to be a big storm. He gets a little more specific on this one, though. He warns people in the North Sea that for sure it's going to be a disaster. Which in fact doesn't occur. The tides are lower and there's no wind at all in the North Sea that day. But on the east coast of the United States, there is a serious disturbance. And click on the next one. Yep. The newspapers on the East Coast in early September began writing letters, and letters to the editor, and their newspaper articles warning everybody that Saxby has made this prediction. And this one is October. This is the morning of the Saxby Gale. But there are warnings up and down the coast in Halifax and St. John and various newspapers that Saxby has made the prediction that there's going to be a serious storm on somewhere. Now, he doesn't say that it's going to hit the United States or it's going to hit Eastern Canada. He just says it's going to be a serious storm. And a lot of people are dismiss the warnings, obviously, because he's made so many mistakes in the past. They can't believe that he's actually going to be right this time. And so people don't pay attention to it. But as he says here, as a warning to all smug, the weather prophet writes in the London Standard that at noon on the 5th of October, the moon, and he goes all through this stuff again, they say, so people are warned to tuck their turnips and potatoes well in bed tomorrow, or they will find them flying in the air. If no disturbance should occur, however, the precaution will do no harm. So they kind of cover themselves. They say, he's giving us this warning, but really, folks.
Is that why they call him a prophet?
Yes, the weather prophet.
Rather than a scientist.
They call him, his fans call him the weather prophet. His fans do, but many others don't. So everybody kind of ignores it, pretty much. Everyone kind of ignores it pretty much. And so come the evening of the 4th, the evening of this article, the weather starts to turn pretty bad. And by early in the evening, it turned very, very bad. And then it hits in full force. It only lasts about 2 hours. I mean, a gale is it's not like a hurricane that can last a day or two. A gale is usually something that comes quickly and ends quickly, and this one did. It came quickly and ended quickly. And it landed right here. This is where it hit land in Maine, right in Eastport. And it was a devastating storm. So you probably can't. This is Eastport in 1869 or 1865, but pretty much. It's hard for you to read it, but all of these are wars, all the way down. There are, and that's only part of them. There are wars on the other side of Broad Cove. So Eastport lives on shipping and fishing, and this is the downtown. It's probably 2.5 times larger in population then than it is today. Maybe even more, maybe 3 times as many people. It's really a very booming town. It has a lot going for it. Go ahead. And here's some pictures of Eastport back about that time. This is looking up Washington Street. It's a very substantial city. Go ahead. And I think that's down, or bank, I can call it Bank Corner. Keep going. I'm not sure, that's on Main Street. Go ahead. That's looking up toward Washington Street. It's a pretty substantial place. I don't know where that is, but that's about 1870. That's after the Gale. And there's the harbor, and there's a steamship, which will probably have 400 or 500 people on it, docked at the end of the pier, which I think is the Eastport International Steamship Company Pier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. And I don't know where this is, but this is another one that's about that period. And there's the pier again. Okay. Oh, and this one's looking up toward the library, I think, from down on Main Street. This one's even earlier than 1869. So Eastport's a pretty big place, and it's a pretty bustling place. It's got a lot of people, a lot of buildings, a lot of wharves, and a lot going for it. But after the Saxby Gale hit, there was not much left of, especially the waterfront. It absolutely destroyed the waterfront, and it arrived in early evening, got a little worse and a little worse until it finally hit its peak. It's only a few hours, but the destruction that it did was absolutely incredible. And the papers all over the United States at that time, the San Francisco Call says Eastport is reportedly nearly demolished. And it estimated that the damage to Eastport, the Galveston, Texas News, a week after the hurricane, says the damage is estimated at $5 million, which is a lot of money back in those days. So it struck Eastport, and it really, again, the St. Louis Republican, awful hurricane on the northeast coast, town of Eastport destroyed. And it did destroy a good part of the city at that time. And I will, if you go on to the next one, what is it? Okay, this is a drawing of a ship off Eastport during the gale in one of the newspapers, showing the incredible waves that, go ahead, Laura. Yeah, so the Eastport Sentinel at that time, in its next publication after the gale, described the hurricane, or the gale, and I'll read it to you. And this is, well, they were able to publish this 3 days after the gale struck. And they say, the most terrific, fearful, and destructive storm and gale that has ever visited this section of the country was that of Monday night last. It can only be described as a perfect and terrible tornado, sweeping along our coast with all the fury of 10,000 gales combined. All day Monday, a heavy wind prevailed, gradually increasing until 5 or 6 p.m., when it blew a gale, and was reckoned the heaviest blow of the season. But its force and fury was not yet half felt. Between the hour and 7 and 9, it culminated in the most fearful tornado ever witnessed here. Huge trees, whose welcome shade and handsome appearance had made them precious and ornamental to our streets. Trees that had stood with the firmest, the fiercest storms for years were torn up by the roots and hurled about as slender limbs. Families resting in fancy security in their usual and quiet and peaceful homes were suddenly brought to realize the severity and force of the storm by the crashing, creaking, and thundering over their heads, and rushing frantically into the open air, find their houses roofless. Or the building, if not of a more substantial kind, is in a position exposed to the fury of the wind. It is carried from its foundations, and in some instances soon tumbles to pieces. Portions of roofs, ends of buildings are torn out, and loose boards and timbers sent whirring through the air. periling the life and limbs of all who happened in the way. Chimneys by actual count during a walk through town to the number of 103 were blown over, most of them breaking close to the roof and lying full length and in perfect condition against the roof. So that was a description in Eastport Sentinel a couple days after the storm. And it went on to describe the particular damage that was done, especially on the waterfront. It's pages and pages long. I will read just some of it to you. It says the number of small craft were lying in the cove at the salt works were all more or less injured. 2 small fishing schooners, one owned by James Boyd and the other by Mr. Robinson, received the greatest injury, the latter being left a complete wreck. 2 old buildings used as storehouses owned by Mr. Layton were leveled to the ground. The Empress, owned by Messrs. Peabody and Cummings, were also in the cove and received damage. The Elba Iron Works was destroyed. The wharf property and buildings on the west side of the salt works owned by Aaron Weber were carried away as fishing schooner, aboard which were 700 quintals of codfish. His entire season's work was driven ashore with heavy damage to vessel and cargo. The loss could not be less than $6,000. The wharf at Buckham's Point, owned by Richard Young, was carried away. Also a smokehouse and establishment by Footing Up Finn and Hattie's, owned by the same party. The Gypsy, owned by Ferris, received rough handling and was damaged to some extent. The wharf owned by Henry Ferris was carried away, leaving nothing to view except the beach strewn with logs and driftwood. Mr. Young's fishing schooner, the Undaunted, was at anchor near his fishing establishment below the yard. It drifted ashore on the rocks and was crushed to atoms. Also wharf damage to some extent. The fish house in the same place was completely destroyed, falling timbers injuring the Hallett men who inflicted serious injuries. It goes on and on. The Nightingale, owned by the Peabody Companies, lying at the southern end of the wharf and drove her bowsprit into a fish house, loosening the roof, which was carried up the hill some distance by the wind. The schooner was damaged. The Traveler, owned by the same firm, was lying at Pierce's Wharf and drifted and pounded about and ruined. And it was ruined until this morning. She was found in rather doubtful condition. So there are pages and pages of these descriptions of the wharves and buildings being either completely demolished or blown out to sea, with a lot of the ships, almost all the ships damaged. And in fact, there was only one wharf of I guess the 37 or 38 that was left in usable condition after the storm hit. It's, as I say, it's a very lengthy description of the damage, and that was only in the center of the town. Out in Broad Cove, it says 7 schooners were piled up on Coney Beach, total wrecks. The lot owned by Captain Lawton Pembroke is lying on its side. It goes on to describe, there were probably at least 100 or more vessels that were completely destroyed, and all the wharves were either washed away or damaged except for one. I noted the steeple of the Congregational Church had blown off, but this one says the steeple and belfry of the Orthodox meeting house is blown off with considerable damage. Considerable damage at Fort Sullivan. Everything was, the descriptions in the papers that Eastport was essentially destroyed were pretty accurate. Anything that was, especially along the shore, was damaged and blown down. And there was further damage. I don't know where Rummery's Cove is. Does anyone know that? Rummery's Cove, that's described as having all the vessels destroyed on the cove.
Could that be Shackford's Cove?
No, I don't think so. It's possible. At West Quoddy Bay, 27 vessels lying at anchor were dismasted and destroyed. And The biggest tragedy was the schooner Marjorie in the harbor just across St. Andrews sunk with a loss, I think, of 18 sailors. And there was another boat up just up the coast that went down with the loss of another 15 or 20 sailors. Over 70 lives were lost. And so that was the damage in Eastport. Go ahead. Yeah, this is just another one. Go ahead. This is describing total loss. That's the car. Is that the Congregational Church here?
Yes, yes.
All right. Well, that steeple was apparently blown off, and the steeples of two churches in Lubec were blown off, landed on the ground over there. Go ahead. Oh, and this is. That's why I asked about Robbie's Bay. It said 27 vessels are ashore on the bay. The schooner Rio, this is in a paper, I think this was out in St. Louis. The schooner Rio was lost in St. Andrews with all on board, 17 in number. Remnant Island swept by waves and all the weirs and smokehouses lost. Towns of Lubec, Perry, Pembroke losses are heavy. Houses and barns down. So the general destruction was absolutely phenomenal. And it says a large part of the town is a perfect wreck. Go ahead. This is Broad Cove, and it's obviously during the gale, but Broad Cove is on the other side, right? Around the point. Yeah. Okay. Almost everything over there was, almost all the vessels that took refuge over there were destroyed. Go ahead for the next one. Okay, now here's the New York. This is a steamship. This is it after the gale, and you can see the logs floating in the water from the debris floating in the water. The New York had 300 or 400 people on it, and it very nearly went down in the gale. And we have an eyewitness account, which is pretty harrowing of the gale on this boat. And it's an account by a journalist named Mr. McCready. I think he was a Canadian. He was in St. John at the time, and the evening before. And he tells a story of his coming across to Eastport on the New York and what happened to it during the gale. And I'll read it to you. Hundreds told of narrow escapes which occurred during the storm. One of the most graphical told personal experience is that of the journalist, Mr. McCready. The night of October 3rd, 1869, he was staying with two friends, Mr. Friesen and Mr. Westcott, in a hotel in St. John, New Brunswick, preparatory to taking the steamer New York to Portland, Maine the next morning. From there, he had planned to take the train to Ottawa. Late in the evening, Mr. Westcott and Mr. Friesen came into McCready's room. "How do you feel about the steamer trip tomorrow?" asked McCready. "There's a bad storm predicted by an amateur astronomer of the British Navy." "That sounds like something Old Mother Shipton would give us," remarked Friesen. Old Mother Shipton was a soothsayer from the 1850s, who had quite a name for herself. "Perhaps you don't know it, Westcott, but she's our weather expert in this country. She gets hers from the buds of trees and the ways the animals behave, and probably from her rheumatism," suggested Westcott. "The sea captains weren't paying any attention to it," said Friesen, walking over to the window and looking out over the harbor. "It certainly looks like a good day today." After an hour more conversation, Westcott and Friesen left McCready's room and went to their own. The next morning, they were around early. It was a perfect morning, bright and clear. Beyond the ships, the water in the bay spread out like a sea of glass. The New York moved slowly out from the wharf on schedule. The crowds on deck waved to their friends on the pier. The paddle wheels churned the water into white foam as she got underway. Almost 300 passengers were on board, and they knew of the prediction about the great storm, which was said to occur that date. The sea was like a mirror, and for the first hour not a breath of air stirred the water. A lot of jokes passed around about this man Saxby. Why, he's not as good as Mother Shifton. She always made good forecasts, remarked somebody. However, some thought that it might be quiet now, but perhaps the storm might come later. About 3 hours after leaving St. John, a breeze began to stir the surface of the bay. The breeze gained strength steadily until he got to Eastport. By then, the big waves were already rolling in and rolling higher and higher all the time. The stop at Eastport took considerable time. Just before they were ready to leave, a messenger came running to the captain with a telegram, which ordered, "Do not proceed, lay over in Eastport." After a short while, another telegram came with further orders, "Do not try to ride out the storm in Eastport, find safe harbor somewhere." The captain knew by this time there was going to be a very bad storm. He immediately ordered the steamer underway and made a run for Rummery Bay, where that is, a landlocked harbor which lay in back of Eastport. The steamer soon entered this harbor with all aboard having a growing respect for Mr. Saxby. When they got into the bay, they found that a lot of schooners and other sailing craft were already there and more were coming. The storm continued to grow worse. To keep the steamer from blowing ashore, the captain maneuvered the boat with the bow toward the storm. He put first one, then another anchor out of the bow. When the storm became so terrible, the captain feared the anchor cables would snap, so he ordered full steam ahead. This took some strain off the anchors. He knew that if the cables broke, the steamer would be crushed like an eggshell against the nearby rocky bluff. For an hour or two, the ship hung there, rocking and plunging, the engines and paddle wheels going full speed to save the cables from being snapped. The roar of the wind and the noise of the water were deafening. Through it all, a man named Whitney moved about from one stateroom to another, assuring the passengers that they were going to come out all right. Around 10 o'clock, the crisis came. Many were at prayers. A group of women were bobbed down on the deck almost to their faces, hanging on to each other as the deck rolled and plunged under them. The captain said, "Let her blow. She can't do anything more than blow us out of the water." Then came a tidal wave. A wall of water 20 feet high struck the ship. One cable snapped. Fortunately, the other hung on for a few seconds. While it did, the vessel swung around. Then this cable snapped. The force of the tidal wave was so great, it drove the ship against the wind and sent it crashing into a narrow passage. As the ship rolled, a timber from a nearby wharf was rammed through the side of the vessel, and several feet of it stuck out through the lower deck. Mr. McCready, he's the author of this piece, used this timber as a gangplank and the hole that it made to reach the shore, and then he took refuge in a small hut-like house occupied by 2 young women. He was followed by his traveling companions. Toward morning, the storm abated. Outside, there was no sign of the steamer. Later that day, the three hired a small tug to take them to Eastport, and there the steamer lay. Somehow she had blown off the mud bank and was able to reach Eastport, where she was beached with everybody safe aboard. The day was brilliant with little wind, but the waves were still piling in. The passengers had to make their home on the beach steamer for several days because all roads had been destroyed and the communications cut off. They ate all the ship's stores and everything in town until all that was left were apples and soda crackers. So that's the story of the New York, but it could have been a lot worse. We could have lost 300 people on that steamship. And at some point during that week that they were here, there was a special service of Thanksgiving in one of the churches in town. Probably wouldn't have been the Congregational Church because the steeple was gone, in which the survivors of the ship gave Thanksgiving for having lived through the gale.
The Episcopal Church was founded in 1857. It could have been one.
Could have been that one, yeah. So, I mean, that was quite an experience, I'm sure, for those people. It took Eastport a long time to recover from that storm. As I say, the downtown was not, I mean, there were a lot of buildings damaged, but there were a lot of houses damaged. There's no reference to the downtown being completely destroyed, but although, as I say, the newspaper reports around the country indicated that Eastport had been entirely destroyed, but that may have just been hype, but the damage was really, really substantial, and it was obviously very terrifying to
The North Church is also 1821, and it's still
Okay.
standing.
Okay, yeah.
On Washington Street.
Well, of course, the storm, the storm didn't stop Eastport. It actually gained some strength and went right up the St. Croix River, through Calais and St. Stephen, and all the way up through St. John and Moncton. And the damage up through there was easily as bad as it was in Eastport. The Machias Valley Observer, Machias Union, I'm sorry. Well, let's say the St. Stephen Courier wrote about the storm, and it was several pages long. It was like the Sentinels. It had a list of hundreds and hundreds of buildings and things that were damaged. But this is what the St. Croix Courier said when it got up to St. Stephen and Calais. It indicated a storm more terrific in character and more disastrous in its consequences than that which occurred on Monday evening between the hours of 6 and 10 o'clock has never been known in this locality. The tide rose to great height, and when the storm was at its hiatus, the fury of the winds was terrible. We have heard of many persons who left their houses fearing that the buildings would fall and bury them in the ruins. In the country district, indeed, several houses were blown down, as well as will be seen by the reports we furnish below, and the amount of property damage is almost incalculable. In many cases, the parties can ill afford to bear the loss. At 8 o'clock, our streets presented an appearance which baffles description. Brickbats from adjacent chimneys were flying before the wind. Signboards were dashing promiscuously around, planting themselves in places they were never designed by their possessors to occupy, and pedestrians were lifted from their feet and carried away by the force of the wind. We made every exertion to obtain a full and accurate report of the damage, and we'll report later, and they do report in another edition on several pages of all of the buildings that were damaged in Charlotte County. The Machias paper gives a list of all of the towns, Crawford, Alexander, Princeton, Cooper, with the damages and all, and I won't read that all to you. It's similar to what you would have heard from the Eastport and the Calais damage. There is one, though, that I'll just read in Crawford, because it's kind of touching in a way. It says, our reporter says Jacob S. Davis and A. Bailey, Abraham, barns are down. Edward Seavey, ditto, horse killed. G.F. Frost, barn down. Thomas Sevo, ditto, and 3 cows killed. E.P. Fenlinson, barn down, house all to pieces. L. Frost, barn unroofed. N.S. Fenlinson, new barn, 76 long, whole roof off and destroyed. Jonathan Love, barn badly wrecked. D.M. Wadsworth, house in fragments. And then the statement goes on. To estimate the loss in Crawford is out of the question. A man's barn down and no means to repair, his only horse killed and no means to buy, all his cows dead, and it's out of his power to replace them or even one of them. All I can say is may God help such. So it was devastating not just to Eastport, but it went up the valley and. What's that? This one was from Crawford. And all the ones from Crawford, Alexander, Princeton, Cooper are all pretty much the same. Everyone lost their barns pretty much. A lot of them lost their houses, and nearly all of them lost cows and horses and their livestock. So the storm, and in terms of losing livestock, the most serious damage in livestock was on the Bay of Fundy up towards St. John. If you drive to St. John before you go 20 miles out of town, you see the marshes. There are those marshes. Well, those marshes are very important to that part of the coast. And cattle and sheep would graze out in those marshes. And the tidal wave that came with the storm flooded the marshes to the extent that thousands of cattle and sheep were drowned. It was a disaster for the people along the coast up on the Fundy Bay. Let's go to the next one. I can't remember where we are here. I think we're almost there. Oh, okay. Let me just, I don't know if we're running out of time or not. I just wanted to briefly, there was other The Urbana, Ohio Gazette reported that 80 barns and 20 houses were destroyed within 4 miles distance of St. Stephen, opposite Calais. Only one wharf remains in Eastport. At Lubec, opposite Eastport, 4 churches badly wrecked, an immense amount of property damage. In St. Stephen, there were three steeples toppled. Steeples could not withstand the wind, the church steeples. And it went up all the way through Moncton and into St. John, though it pretty well petered out in St. John. The local reverend says, the night was one of horror on land as well as sea. The extreme darkness, the constant roar and turmoil of the wind, the lashing rains, the groaning of trees, the hail of debris paralyzed the entire area. Huge forests were being flattened like fields of grain. Entire buildings were lifted from their foundations. Residents knelt and prayed, fearing this was the end of time. And certainly there was never another storm that even came close to equaling it, although every other bad storm that we've had has been compared to it, saying it wasn't as bad as the Saxby Gale. And certainly it wasn't. The greatest damage, the greatest financial loss was not, however, to the buildings and wards and homes of people on the coast. The biggest loss financially was to the forests. And George Boardman, who was a lumberman who made his fortune and decided in his 40s that he had enough money, he didn't want to make any more money, he was going to retire and spend his life doing what he wanted to do, which was tromp the woods and marshes of Washington County and Charlotte County and collect specimens of birds, and that's what he did. He spent his time in the woods, often with Professor Baird of the Smithsonian Institute, and he collected hundreds of specimens, which he had in a building in Calais on Lafayette Street. And when he died, he gave all that to the city of Calais, and the city of Calais didn't want it, and they gave it to the museum in St. John, and you can see his collection up in the St. John Museum if you're interested. It's really quite a collection. But Boardman Boardman writing to Professor Baird at the Smithsonian right after the storm, he says, "Nothing like this ever took place here. It appeared like a whirlwind. It took the roof off my long woodshed, my old store, part of the roof of the barn on the hill. The Universalist Church was a perfect wreck. The railroad bridge over the falls in front of my house fell into the river, also the covered bridge at Bering. More than 100 buildings in St. Stephen were ruined, and in our cemetery, more than 1,000 trees were uprooted and broken. Said at Eastport, 40 buildings were destroyed and unroofed, several lives lost, and most of all the fishing craft wrecked. At Eastport and St. Andrews and both the islands, the tide was very high and damaged the wharves much. 67 vessels ashore. Those that went to soft places came off, many went on the rocks and were ruined." He says, "The blow did not last about an hour. It was heaviest at 8 o'clock in the evening. There was very little wind in Bangor, not much in St. John." He writes, "The great loss to this country from the Saxby Gale will be in the woods. We have had some of our men out exploring, and they say they can walk 10 miles at a time on trees that are down without stepping onto the ground. In some places for half a mile, every tree is down. The bridges and buildings can easily be put back, but the woods, all down, will soon get on fire and burn all over the down district." The wind did not reach very far up the river, only about 30 or 40 miles. It was heaviest around the shores. The Saxby Gale will go into history as the most destructive storm that ever visited this coast. And there's confirmation for that, because in a letter written in 1887, a fellow who was sent out to survey the hemlock forest after the gale said, "The destructive effects of the gale, which extended more than 90 miles up the St. John River from its mouth, may be estimated by the fact that shortly after its occurrence, I was called upon to examine and report upon some timberland which had been subject to his influence. 2 days were spent in such an inspection, during which time he said, I failed in traveling to exceed a distance of from 3 to 4 miles a day. The roots, tops, and trunks of blown trees meeting me at every single step, presenting formidable obstacles to anything like a rapid advance. He said the gale was more destructive to the hemlock than any other tree because of its heavy top and great resistance to the wind. And other articles confirmed that the woods were badly damaged. And as late as 1897, the people of Lubec recall that 28 years ago this month there occurred the famous Saxby Gale, which devastated a large portion of eastern Maine, eastern Washington County. Much valuable village property was badly damaged. Large tracts of valuable timberland were lost in Edmonds, Marion, and Plantation 14, and they were destroyed by the gale and later by forest fires. And the history of Pembroke says that the lumbering industry around Pemaquan Lake and in that part of the country was completely devastated for a decade or two because of the gale. So that was the Saxby Gale, and it was everything that people said it was. There was no great exaggeration in terms of the reports. It was devastating. Yeah.
Could they measure the wind speed?
The wind speed is estimated between 100 and 110 miles an hour. I mean, back in those days, they didn't have the scientific equipment we have to measure those sorts of things, but it was pretty incredible. And Eastport Sentinel usually would always mention the anniversary of the storm. And in New Brunswick, the anniversaries, I mean, this is the Moncton 60th anniversary of the disastrous storm. Up in Moncton, there's a building that has a plaque on it that shows the high water mark of the storm. It's never apparently been exceeded or even come close to it. Yeah.
How high about street level is the?
What's that?
How high about street level is the line?
I don't know. I really can't. I'm not that familiar with. But Moncton and St. John didn't get hit too badly. Moncton did. Sackville and a lot of those towns in New Brunswick, especially the lower lying ones, got the tidal wave flooded them. And Sackville's not a very big town, and when they finally estimated the damage to Sackville, which was a much smaller town than Eastport, it was like $1 million in 1869 dollars. I mean, that's a lot of money. Yeah.
Were the reputations of Saxby and Mrs. Shipton highly regarded after this disaster?
Well, Saxby's never was particularly highly regarded. Mrs. Shipton was, well, she had, most of the predictions that she made were apparently, if you looked at the timing of them, were made after her death. So, I mean, she was kind of, so they probably were too accurate. Saxby had a real problem because he predicted a number of storms that just didn't, well, you take the Saxby Gale. He predicted that the Saxby Gale was going to strike also in London, okay? And it was going, the main devastation was going to occur in the North Sea, all right? And he didn't even mention Atlantic Province or Eastport. That was not in his prediction. But his predictions were so general, it was hard to know. And as it turns out, in London and in the North Sea, where he said there was going to be the biggest destruction, the tides were lower than usual, and there wasn't even a breeze. Okay, and so the royal astronomer came down on him pretty hard, but it didn't stop him from predicting things. He continued to make predictions. He made one in Peru later on in the 1870s, which had thousands of people so scared they left their homes and went into the mountains for 2 weeks and nothing happened. They weren't happy, and there was I don't know if I could find it. some poet down there wrote a poem about Mr. Saxby, which is not very edifying. Yeah.
Do they have any estimate of the lives that were lost due to the storm?
Yeah, they figure between 70 and 80. Half of those at sea, half of them on land. Yeah.
In all the newspaper articles during this gale or before or after, was there any mention at all of the Passamaquoddy?
No. I didn't see any mentions of the Passamaquoddy. And I should say that we say this is the most powerful gale that ever struck this area. Of course, we've only been here a second of the time that this has been area's been inhabited. I suspect in the 10,000 years that the Passamaquoddies lived here, probably there were worse storms at some point. This is just since we arrived, since the white man arrived, that this would be the worst storm on record. And I'm not sure whether whether tribal history and legend and talk about any storms that may have been more powerful, but I would suspect that during the 10,000 years that they were here, or 15 before we arrived, the white men arrived, there were such storms.
Let's
But-
take one more question. Anybody? You've answered all their questions.
Oh, good.
Wow, I'm sure he'll be up, yeah, give him, I'm sure that Al will be